looking throughout monitoring and in other areas for a sample policies and procedures that some LEAs could use. And she was gracious enough to allow us to utilize her policy and procedure manual. That policy and procedure manual is uploaded onto the conference website, so you guys do have access to that. And we're going to tag team a little bit. I'm going to be talking about some of the things that I saw, and she'll come in intermittently and give some additional information as well. But this is really just a surface level look at policies and procedures. You'll see later in the presentation at Mega, we will do a deeper dive into it on that full day. So just know that we're starting the process today because we heard you. We know that policies and procedures are important for you to know and hear about. So we have started that process here today. As we start this journey on Policies and Procedures Handbook, because Edgar and ESSA has it labeled everywhere that you need policies and procedures for almost everything. We have to know the difference between a policy and a procedure. A policy is something that will be board approved. It is something that doesn't change frequently. It's very infrequently changed. It's that bedrock policy that, in essence, let me give you an example. I have time and effort. So I have a time and effort policy that says that I will do time and effort in my district following the procedures that are outlined in my manual. Then I have procedures which can change frequently. It will say the who, what, when, where, how, how we do everything in our district. And that can change. And in the example of time and effort, if we're looking at procedure, this is where you're going to get, and we're going to show that example in just a minute of hers, where you're going to get into the difference between 100% certification, split funded, stipends, supplements, substitute, other federal funded positions, because every penny that is funded with federal dollars, if it is personnel, has to have time and effort. So that is the difference between your policies and your procedures. And it's important to know that difference because we get that question a lot in compliance monitoring. Do I need a policy? Do I need a procedure? Well, depending on what Edgar says, it's one or the other. But even if you have a policy, I think you would agree, it's important to have a procedure behind it.
That's what I was going to say. In my procedure manual, I don't want it to be board approved because I make changes to it all the time. And as we learn new things, we may make a new procedure or perfect that procedure. But then there are policies like y'all talked about earlier, like your enrollment policy, that is going to be board approved. And we may reference that in our procedure manual, but that is something that, yeah, you have to go through your board approval. But the procedure manual is just, it's a helpful guide to just kind of explain those policies.
And you did go through compliance monitoring, so I'll ask you a question. You can see on the screen that I basically did multiple screenshots of not all, but a lot of the policies and procedures that are required during monitoring. And I know that you went through everything. Can you talk a little bit before we get into the policies and procedures about how that helped and what you did to ensure you had everything?
Sure. So once we got this checklist, I will say having the procedure manual saved me a lot of headache. And I have to give credit to Holly Box, who was the federal programs director before I was, because she had started that when I was still a principal. And since the addition of all of our COVID funds and things like that, we have just updated that. But having this checklist and going through our procedural manual saved us a lot of headache to be ready for monitoring. And then there were things that I would turn in and I think, man, this is spot on, and Jason sends it back. It's like, I'm still missing that. And so then I would make that phone call and say, maybe I don't know what this is talking about. I thought I had that perfect. And he would clarify, and I'm like, oh, okay, now I know what I need to add.
One thing that I did hear before I actually get into your policies and procedures, I know a lot of districts have policies and procedures, but a policy may be located here, a procedure may be located here. Am I hearing that you guys have a federal programs policy and procedure manual?
Yes, so we have a federal programs manual, and we review it every year. And at the start of the year, after we have our advisory meeting, any changes that we need to make, we amend, and then I pass that out to every Title I school, their administrators, and we go over it every single year. So, and then if we need to refer to it, we can do that. Or if we have new people come on board, they get that manual first, and we start just reviewing those procedures.
And I guess one other question before I dive in, I think is an important point to kind of focus on. Is your policy and procedure manual just programmatic, or do you cooperate and have a team effort in that policy and procedure manual for federal programs? Does it include fiscal, supplement, not supplant, everything?
We try to include everything, and that's why I told Susan she may have to come up here if she has to answer anything, because Susan is our federal programs accountant, and so 100% we work together. So some of the things are strictly programmatic, and then some of the things I borrowed from our finance department, and I get those things from Susan or just various people, our CSFO, and we try to make sure that's in there as well.
That's awesome. So one tidbit that I took away from that is when you have that relationship between departments, combining everything into one policy and procedure handbook for federal programs could be a positive way to continue that relationship. Would you agree?
Absolutely.
All right, so let's dive into some policies and procedures that I wanted to focus on, and most of those are coming from the list from compliance monitoring, but it's important to focus on because a lot of LEAs, when we start the monitoring process and we're looking for policies and procedures, these are some of the ones that might actually be missing. So it's important to make sure as you're developing it to focus on some of these. So the first one is financial reporting procedures. And for any CSFOs in the room, we know that you are required, to report on your financials. Every month you have to upload stuff to your website and everything has to be accurate. But is there a actual procedure written down that goes over what it is that you are doing on a monthly basis to ensure that it's being done? So, like if you look at and it's large enough, good, I did a decent screenshot. But all of these are in that handbook too, so feel free to look there as well. But on this financial reporting procedures, as you're looking at it, it talks about copies. It talks not only about the current year, it talks about the prior fiscal year. So it's important, you have to have a record retention policy, which we'll dive into in a little bit. But it's also important that you have a process of keeping those copies, reporting it to the public, and then if you look at the very, very end, that's where the relationship comes in. It's talking about the Taiwan office run budgets. Maybe not. Okay, here we go. We're doing a very quick change. Look at that. The Taiwan office will run budget summaries and also expenditure reports, and the Title I director suggests and works with the schools with that. So it's not just the CSFO, it seems like, in your district. It's you and in your position also working with your schools. Is that correct?
That is correct. And that's definitely one we got help with because of our relationship with our finance department.
So as we go to the next one, now we have internal controls and checks and balances, because if one person is doing everything, the system falls. It, again, has to be a relationship. There has to be more than one person that is working together to ensure everything is happening. For instance, in here, it's talking about the overall process where it starts with the financial side, it goes to the programmatic side, and then it goes back to the financial side. So there is those checks and balances going on. It starts here, it goes to this side, it comes back, and everything is completed. So can you talk just a little bit about that?
Sure, that's our everyday life. So when our school decides to make a purchase, of course, they turn that into a requisition, and it comes to our office, to our federal programs accountant, Susan back there, and then we print those off. I go to her office. She has a little box in her office for me, and I come in there, sit down, and grab all those out of the box, and then we read through them together. So I'm looking, when they turn that requisition in, Susan won't even take it if it doesn't have the ASIP questions attached to it. So when I come in, I'm looking at the requisition and the ASIP questions. And so I read through all of them, and every now and then she's waiting for me to read them, and she's looking because I'm like, what do you think about that? And she's like, that's the one I was wondering about too. And so then if there's something that we have a question about, or maybe it just wasn't clarified enough from the way they described in their ASIP that it's going to be used, then we make a phone call. And we're there together so we can call the school and say, okay, we just read this. What did you mean? How are you using it? Explain that to me. And sometimes, it's just us getting clarification just like you guys do with us. And we're like, okay, well, maybe just spell that out a little better or explain that exactly. Or then sometimes we're like, that's a no. So, but we do that together. And like I said, I just come by her office every few days, or some weeks are more than others. And we just sit down together, I grab those out of the box, and we just go through those.
Awesome. She jumped ahead, by the way. I have some pictures of appendixes that will actually show you the ASIP question, but it's okay. I won't say anything.
Yeah.
So jumping in, time and effort. And we just gave that example. We have a policy, and she does have a policy, but she also has very detailed procedures. She even has detailed procedures to the point that she says for her substitutes that they do it as purchase service, object code 300, so we don't have to do time and effort. But then she has a statement saying anything that is a stipend or a supplement, they treat it as 100% certification. So they still address substitutes by saying if we do have to give them something, we're still going to do this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So on our timesheets, especially with all of our COVID funds, so like our tutoring or our bus drivers, if they're driving for after-school tutoring, and that's 100% a part of the grant, then on their timesheet, there's 100% a statement that, that the work that they're doing is 100% towards that grant. So we just have that on all their timesheets, and we just make sure that they're using the correct timesheets, and anything that's related to federal funds, it's on there, it's printed on their timesheets. They sign it, they verify that, so when they turn it in, that's verified.
Awesome. I do not have in the PowerPoint sample timesheets. However, she can give, and in the ALSDE federal programs, ALSDE document section, there was a training that we did a couple years ago at Mega, I believe, that also has some examples. So there is lots of resources out there.
Susan, do you have anything to add to that? Anything to that?
So let's dive a little bit more into compensation. Again, you have to have checks and balances in everything you do. If you don't have it where it's not just going through one person, there's an issue there. It must go through multiple people. So when we're talking about reconciliation, a lot of CSFOs and federal programs, people are thinking just the financial piece. And yes, compensation is financial, and we'll all agree to that because it is object code, 010 to 199 plus the benefits in the 200s. But most of the time, no one goes back and looks at the FTEs or the percentage of time, because if you have a split funded person, you have to go back after the fact and say, all right, based on the timesheet, yes, in my budget, it's supposed to be 75-25, but according to the timesheet, they only did 60-40. Well, you can't pay them 75% if they only work 60% on their timesheet. So there has to be reconciliation, and they do a good job, and that's why I highlighted that last statement. Once the payroll staff has balanced everything, the CSFO then looks at it for final approval. So again, those checks and balances, making sure, payroll's looking at it, federal programs is looking at it, and then the CSFO looks at it. So it's multiple hands touching it. And when multiple people have eyes on it, the mistakes that might happen are caught.
Yeah.
All right, no other questions. So let's talk about allowability. So Edgar is very, very clear. You must have procedures on allowability. And I will say Calhoun County actually has two different sections about allowability procedures in their manual. One that's more general, I would call it more like a policy, even though it's procedures, but then a very detailed procedure. So the one up here, is that baseline procedure that says we follow Edgar, we follow OMB circulars. Remember, OMB circulars have migrated into Edgar, but you can use them as separate because they are available still, and they're actually a little bit more stringent, which I think fine tunes it for you guys.
Right. And that is definitely, again, coming from working with our finance department. So that's even in, I believe, our finance manual, the statement is about allowability. But on the program side, for our administrators, is the next piece, because it kind of means, as they read that, they're like, okay, so what does that mean? So that's why we kind of spell that out a little more detailed in the procedures.
Okay, with those procedures, can you talk a little bit about, because it's on the screen right now, but can you kind of talk a little bit about, I have an expenditure, I'm bringing it to you. Based on your procedures, can you very, very briefly kind of walk me through what entails your allowability check?
So I think that's like what we were talking about earlier with, like when the school presents like something they want to purchase. Is that what we're talking about? Mm-hmm. So, like I said, they send that in. We review that. We look at, does it meet their needs assessment? Is it in their ASIP? And did they provide the documentation to show us that? And then at that point, then we can say yes or no based on that conversation, and then we send that back, and then at that time, they create a PO for that purchase.
All right, a follow-up question to that. We all know, and it was in Federal Feud if you were here yesterday, but the allowabilities, it has to be reasonable, necessary, allocable. Mm-hmm. Tied to a budget line. The procedures here do a good job outlining that, but how do you guys do that in everyday practice, and how do you ensure that what's in procedures are followed?
Well, just by reviewing those, is that what you mean, I guess? Mm-hmm. Just reviewing the ASIP, I think is what, is that what you're talking about, like the evidence and reading through that to make sure that it is necessary, and that what they're going to use it for follows the grant, that it is necessary, it's reasonable, that they have quotes attached if it's at a certain point, those kind of things.
Awesome. And one thing now that I do want to point out, she was talking about the ASIP questions. Well, this is that form that she was talking about. So it is a part of their allowability procedures, and she keeps outlining that. It always goes back to the plan, and if that isn't in your allowability procedures, that is an important part that's missing, because it can be reasonable, necessary, allocable, but if it's not in your plan, then it's not allowable.
That's right.
So record retention. You are required to have a record retention policy, and there is a lot of questions about, is it 3 years, is it 5 years, is it 7 years? Based on your procedures and what we do as a state as well, it is at least 5 years. And is that for all programmatic and financial records for your district? Do you keep everything that is attached?
Yes, we would keep everything for that.
Awesome. So making sure that you do have that policy in place. And remember, the policy is supposed to be board approved because it is a policy. It is not a procedure. So making sure that that is in place too. And you can see it's their policy 2.07, so you know that it's already in their board policy handbook. They just moved it to their federal programs handbook to ensure that was in one place.
Right, that's one of those. Like I said, some of them are in our board approved policy, and if so, we just copied and pasted that into our manual just so it would all be in one place for our administrators.
One policy, cross out the word policy, one procedure that is not always in a procedure for finances is what's known as the domestic preference procedures. And one additional one, also contract provisions. Brittany talked about during the compliance monitoring session as well as the panel did, but it's essential that you have procedures in place. One, that shows domestic preference because as it is right now, I know there is some Edgar discussions of changes and stuff like that, but if we're talking about right now, there has to be domestic preference. You can't do local preference. You can't do state preference with federal dollars. It must be domestic. So you have to have that domestic preference procedure as well as procedures to say that you are going to do Appendix 2 to 2 CFR Part 200. If you don't remember that, that's okay. It's in the Compliance Monitoring Handbook, which you can view as well.
And this is one we had to update because when we saw that first on the checklist, I was like, I have no idea what that is. And so I had to call, get some clarification, and that's one that we amended because we knew it was coming. We had read through that and knew that was something that we needed to add.
So let me ask about that because I think it goes back to your self-monitoring procedures, which we will get back to in a minute. When you first had your handbook, prior to monitoring, prior to even turning it in, and you were looking at the procedures that we were looking, this wasn't in there.
No, it wasn't. So it was one that as we were reading it, we said, that's not something that we have. So we had to make that adjustment.
So that's an important thing to think and talk through while you're doing your self-monitoring every year, which I think all the panelists set up here, they do to some form of capacity as well as Calhoun County. You have to make sure that everything that is in there is updated and is in there, and that's why we highlighted this procedure in there just so, as an example of this is something that is not always in a policy procedure manual, but it should be because it is a procedure that is required. Then we go to competitive procurement, and this is something that is a revolving bullet, I think, in a lot of cases, because what is state, what is federal? Does it change, the state law change from, 15 to 40? If you're not updating it, you have to use whatever's in your policy and procedure manual. As you can see for them, they did update it prior to giving it to us. They changed it to 40,000. So that also goes to your self-monitoring.
Right, yes, that came from my finance friends.
So it's every year things are changing. You should be updating, and this is a pure example of how they updated even before giving it to us. So they know that the micro purchase threshold goes to 10,000, and they're actually more restrictive because they say if it's between 5 and 10,000, they still require quotes. That, remember, as a district, you have flexibility, but with that flexibility, you also can do additional safeguards. And for Calhoun County, it looks like they've added that additional safeguard in place.
That's correct.
So, and then if you go down to the next line with small purchase, which the verbiage is going to be changing with the new rollout of the changes, and they've actually updated it here as well, it's going to be the simplified acquisition threshold, which a lot of CSFOs know about, but it's also known right now as small purchase, but that is going to be, if it passes, dwindling away, and now it will be simplified acquisition. But they are very detailed. 40,000 or above, it's a sealed bid. Under 40,000, this is what we're doing. And the one thing that I want to just make sure that I hone in on is that very bottom. They say that a sealed bid is required for 40,000 or more, but then they make sure they state if it's above $250,000, they do require a formal bid because once you go above 250, you are required to self-bid, and that's why I think that's why you wrote it that way.
That's correct, yes. And I will say this, based on what y'all talked about earlier with the panel, and we were talking about who do you bring to the table. One person that I didn't even think about until monitoring that was such a huge help for me was our superintendent secretary, because she had all of those bids and all of that just tucked away, and I'm in there struggling, and she was like, I can help you with this. And so she just, had all of that, the bid process, everything. So that's somebody you might not think about getting on your team, but she was very, very helpful.
So I think that really just goes
Yeah.
back to relationships. If you are working together, if it's not a silo in isolation and you're actually working together as a team, this policy and procedure handbook, you have it created. It's either written down in 100 different places, it's in somebody's head, or it's in usually one of those two places. But if we work together and grab the knowledge out of where it is, whether written or in, verbal knowledge, this policy and procedure handbook, I think, is easy to create. So, talking about property management, there's a lot that goes on with property management. The one thing that I really want to highlight is stolen equipment. And they have a very good policy. Scratch that word, procedure. See, you can't always interchange, and I think it's important to highlight that too, because a lot of people like to interchange policy and procedure, but they do have very distinct responsibilities in the process. So with the stolen equipment, you have to file an incident report with your district. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And by filing that incident report, you are actually acknowledging that it's stolen rather than just lost.
That's correct.
And it is very distinct, the difference. In monitoring, we ask for your disposal procedures, and we ask for 4 different categories. We ask for stolen, we ask for loss, we ask for my brain just went out. But lost, stolen, disposed, obsolete.
I was gonna say obsolete.
So it's just important to know all of those things are in place. And so there's a lot of slides about self-monitoring, but I think and you can go through all of these procedures. Ultimately, there's timetables and other things of that nature, but I really think the most important thing is if you're self-monitoring on at least a yearly basis, if not more, you're going to catch all the things that are filling in the gap. And with a lot of the changes that are potentially coming up, it's even more important to be engaged in this self-monitoring process.
Absolutely. We did have, there were some things, with monitoring, of course, that we were, we were apprehensive about, and I'm not going to say it wasn't a lot of work, but because we have done it right through every year, it made it a lot easier to just go gather and find and upload. So, it definitely pays off to self-monitor and to have those procedures in place because it does make it a lot more manageable.
Absolutely. One thing we want to just hone in on that they did find in the monitoring process was supporting documentation. So it's not just your procedures, it's also making sure your supporting documentation is up to date and accurate. And you can see the before and after for their inventory management. The before had a lot of the things that were required, but it didn't have all 9 requirements that had to be on there.
And so thankfully, we have an awesome technology department. So after I was at one of our, I think it was a fall conference, and we started talking about the FANG numbers and things that were required, I went back in a bit of a panic, and I was like, we don't have this on our inventory. And so they have an inventory system that all they had to do was add it in there. They made it easy. And so that is something that we changed because we didn't have all the required pieces. And so, but we knew, the funding sources was on there, and they also had every purchase order attached to the inventory item, so it was very easy to add the FANG numbers, and the technology department helped me do all of that, but we did make that change on our inventory log.
Awesome. I know we're getting close with time, and I apologize if I'm a couple minutes over, but we do want to just take like 1 minute. Is there any questions on the floor before we thank Summer for coming up and walking us through some things? We'll also make sure that the email goes into the documentation